The air was thick with anticipation as Jake pressed the brake pedal and the old van screeched to a halt at the edge of the crumbling town. The setting sun cast long shadows over the dilapidated buildings, each one more weather-beaten than the last. He leaned forward over the steering wheel, taking in the sight of Rust Haven. Its streets were empty, like a place abandoned by time itself, and the looming mountains behind it only added to the town's desolate charm. "Welcome to nowhere," Mike quipped from the passenger seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the dashboard. He flashed his usual grin, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Perfect for a weekend adventure, huh?" Sarah said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. She adjusted her glasses and peered out the window, trying to hide the unease that had been gnawing at her since they left the last sign of civilization hours ago. In the back seat, Laura remained silent, her eyes fixed on the distant outline of the mountains. There was something about them, about the way they rose like jagged teeth against the skyline, that made her shiver, though she couldn't explain why. She had felt it ever since Jake first brought up the idea of exploring the abandoned mine. A sinking feeling she couldn't shake, like a whispering voice warning her not to go. But when Jake had called, desperate for her to come along, she couldn't say no. "Let's just get this over with," Jake muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He was always the one pushing them into danger, chasing the next thrill. But there was something different about him this time, a shadow behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Rust Haven's few remaining residents watched them from doorways and windows as they drove through the town. Pale faces, withered by age or something worse, stared at the group with unreadable expressions. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, feeling as if the townspeople knew something they didn't, as if they were intruders in a place long forgotten. When they pulled up to the rickety general store, the only sign of life in the otherwise ghostly town, Jake cut the engine. Silence descended on them, thick and oppressive. "Are we really going to do this?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper, though she hadn't meant it to be. Her skepticism was clear, but there was something more, a flicker of fear she tried to suppress. Jake shot her a look. "We've come this far. I'm not turning back now." The door to the store creaked open, and an old man shuffled out, his eyes clouded by time. He regarded them with a weary sigh, as if he'd seen too many people like them before, young, reckless, and full of the arrogance that only comes before disaster. "Y'all looking for the mine?" His voice was raspy, like gravel scraping against rock. Jake nodded, stepping forward. "That's right. Heard it's been abandoned for decades." The old man spat on the ground and gave a grim smile, showing crooked yellow teeth. "Abandoned, yeah, but not empty." He pointed a gnarled finger toward the mountains. "Plenty gone in, not many come back." Laura felt the chill that had been lingering at the edge of her thoughts tighten its grip on her chest. Her breath caught for a moment as she glanced at Jake, waiting for him to reconsider, but his eyes were set, locked on the mountains with a stubborn determination. "We'll be fine," Jake said, brushing off the warning. "We've handled worse." The old man snorted. "Suit yourselves. Don't say I didn't warn you." With that, the group piled back into the van, driving the last stretch toward the mine's entrance. The road narrowed and turned into a dirt path, winding through dense trees before finally opening to a wide clearing at the mouth of the mine. The rusted sign overhead read, "King's Hollow Mine," in faded letters, half obscured by creeping vines. The entrance yawned open like the mouth of some long-forgotten beast, waiting to swallow them whole. Mike hopped out of the van, his face betraying a flicker of doubt as he surveyed the scene. "Well, this looks welcoming." Jake was already pulling out the flashlights and gear. Come on, we didn't come all this way to chicken out now. Laura's heart pounded as she stood in front of the mine, the air cooler and heavier here than anywhere else. It felt wrong. The entire place reeked of abandonment, but it was more than that. There was a presence in the air, a weight that pressed down on her chest. She looked back at Sarah, who had gone quiet, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Do you feel that?" Laura asked quietly. Sarah hesitated, her skepticism cracking for just a moment. "Yeah, I don't know what it is, but this place doesn't feel right." Before they could dwell on it, Jake turned on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gathering dusk as he stepped forward. "Let's go." They followed him, the crunch of gravel under their feet the only sound as they passed into the darkness of the mine. The air inside was damp and musty, carrying the faintest hint of rot. Laura's skin prickled as the temperature dropped noticeably. The further they went, the quieter it became. The world outside seemed to vanish as they descended deeper into the earth, the mine's damp walls closing in around them. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off the walls in distorted whispers. "Why does it feel like the air's getting heavier?" Mike asked, his voice tight with unease. "Probably just the pressure." "We're going deeper underground," Jake replied, but there was a tension in his voice that betrayed his usual bravado. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them into single file as they pressed forward. Laura found herself at the back of the line, her eyes darting nervously from side to side, searching the shadows. Every few steps, she swore she could hear something just out of range, a soft, rhythmic sound like breathing. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the darkness surged forward, enveloping her. She gasped, stumbling, but caught herself before anyone noticed. It was just her imagination. It had to be. But then she heard it again. A voice, low, almost a whisper coming from deep within the mine. It was too faint to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling. "Guys," Laura said, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" They all froze. "What?" Jake's flashlight swung toward her, casting long shadows along the uneven walls. I thought I heard something, like someone talking." Sarah's face paled slightly. "I heard it too," she admitted reluctantly. "But maybe it's just the wind." "There's no wind down here," Mike muttered. Before anyone could respond, a sudden deafening crack split the air. The walls around them trembled violently, and before they could react, the ceiling above them gave way with a thunderous roar. Dust and debris filled the air as rocks tumbled down, cutting them off from the entrance. Laura screamed as darkness swallowed them whole. The collapse was sudden, suffocating them in a blanket of earth and stone. When the dust finally settled, there was nothing but silence. Complete, crushing silence. Jake's flashlight was the first to flicker back to life, revealing a wall of solid rock where the entrance had once been. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Jake turned, his face pale and drawn. "There's only one way left to go." They stared at the endless, yawning tunnel before them, into the darkness, and something far deeper in the mine whispered back. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones as the thick darkness pressed in around them. It had been hours, at least it felt like hours, since the collapse sealed them inside. Time had become elastic, stretching and warping in the blackness. The battery-operated lantern they found in Jake's pack cast feeble light on their ashen faces, but the deeper shadows swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Jake took the lead, his jaw clenched in frustration, moving with determination despite the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. His mind raced with half-formed thoughts of escape, but there was no shaking the gnawing sensation that they were already lost. "This place shouldn't be this big," Sarah muttered, mostly to herself as she followed close behind. "It doesn't make sense. We should have hit the end by now." "You want to go back the way we came?" Mike snapped, his nerves fraying with each step. "Oh, wait, we can't, because it's blocked." Laura, walking in the rear, remained silent. Something was terribly wrong, and she had felt it ever since they first stepped into the mine. Now her senses screamed with a clarity that made her stomach turn. The air tasted different here, thick and sour, with a faint metallic undertone. And the mine, the very walls around them, felt as if they were alive, breathing. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the tunnel stretching ahead of them, unchanged. They should have reached the other side by now, or at least some sign of life, something to indicate they weren't walking deeper into oblivion. But instead, the mine seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder with each step. The faint echoes of their footsteps seemed to mock them, whispering secrets they weren't meant to hear. "This isn't right," Sarah said, stopping in her tracks. Her flashlight flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows on the uneven walls. "We've been walking in circles. I swear we passed this same junction an hour ago." Jake paused, scanning the tunnel ahead. It was identical to the one behind them. Walls of cracked stone, withered timbers barely holding the ceiling up, and deep shadows that seemed to shift if you stared too long. "No, we haven't," Jake growled, unwilling to give in to the creeping doubt clawing at him. "We just need to keep moving. There's got to be an exit." "But what if there isn't?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "What if we're not supposed to get out?" Sarah shot him a look, but Laura caught the flicker of fear behind her eyes. It was a fear she had felt herself ever since the collapse. The mine didn't want them to leave. It was playing with them, twisting around them like a labyrinth, tightening its grip. Suddenly, there was a sound, a sharp metallic clang that reverberated through the tunnel, stopping them all in their tracks. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a breath. Maybe it's an old support beam or something," Jake said, though his voice wavered. "Number that wasn't the sound of metal breaking," Laura said, stepping forward. Her voice was cold, certain. "It sounded like a gate closing." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. She didn't need to elaborate for them to understand the implications. Somewhere deep in the mine, something had closed. A door. A trap. Suddenly, Laura's flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second, the walls seemed to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. Her breath hitched. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Jake swung his light toward her. "See what?" "The walls," she said, her voice barely audible. "They moved." Mike let out a nervous laugh. "You're losing it, Laura." But then it happened again. The walls, solid and immovable moments ago, seemed to shift. The stones quivered as if being stirred from a deep sleep. This time, everyone saw it. The mine around them rippled, the corridor narrowing slightly as the stones pressed inward, shifting and realigning. The air changed too. It became colder, damper, almost suffocating. "This can't be happening," Sarah said, her voice wavering. She pressed her hand against the wall and quickly pulled it back, her face contorting in horror. "It's warm. The stone. It's warm." Laura stepped forward, holding her flashlight steady. Her hands were shaking, but she couldn't let it show. The others were already on the edge. "We need to stay calm." "I am calm," Jake snapped, his voice rising. But you're not helping by talking about shifting walls and warm stones. We all saw it, Jake, Sarah said quietly. This place it's changing. Jake looked around, the rising panic in his chest threatening to overwhelm him. For the first time since they had entered the mine, he didn't have an answer. His instincts told him to push forward, to keep moving, but every step they took seemed to bring them deeper into the nightmare. Without warning, a low, groaning sound reverberated through the tunnel, like the earth itself was creaking under an immense weight. The ground beneath them trembled, and the walls, so impossibly solid, began to press inward again, inch by inch. "Move!" Jake shouted, as the walls seemed to shift toward them, the space narrowing unnaturally fast. The group broke into a panicked run, stumbling through the dark passage, the tunnel itself warping around them. What had been a clear path moments ago was now twisting, turning, narrowing. The floor dipped and rose as if the mine were rearranging itself, drawing them further in. Laura's heart raced as she followed the beam of her flashlight, barely avoiding jagged stones and broken timbers. Her breaths came fast, shallow. Something was chasing them, though she couldn't see it, couldn't name it. But it was there, pushing them forward, deeper into the mine's clutches. Suddenly, they reached a dead end, a solid wall of stone that hadn't been there before. The tunnel behind them had shifted, sealing them in. Sarah let out a strangled cry, pounding her fists against the stone. No, 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 this wasn't here. It wasn't here. We're trapped, Mike said, collapsing to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. We're never getting out of here. Jake stepped back, breathing heavily, scanning the walls. He was trying to hold it together, but the cracks in his composure were showing. There has to be a way out. But before he could finish, Laura heard it again. The voice. The same low whisper she had heard earlier. But this time it was closer. Too close. Laura, it called, soft and insidious, a voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It wasn't the voice of one person. It was many, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices overlapping, calling her name. She turned slowly, shining her flashlight at the stone wall behind them. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to look. And there, in the faint light, she saw them. Faces. Dozens of them. Their hollow eyes staring out from the cracks in the stone, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They were etched into the very rock, frozen in time, but their eyes seemed to follow her every movement. Laura stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "We're not alone," she whispered. The others turned to see the faces, their eyes widening in horror. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the narrow tunnel, bouncing off the walls in a cacophony of voices. They're trapped here," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Just like us." "What do they want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes locked on the grotesque faces. Before anyone could answer, the tunnel trembled violently once again, the walls shifting and groaning as the ground beneath their feet crumbled. Jake grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back as the floor gave way in front of them, revealing a dark pit below. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice hard. "Now!" With no other choice, they hurried back down the twisted tunnel, the mine shifting around them with every step. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. Laura's mind raced, but one thought echoed above all the others. They were no longer in control. The mine was, and it wasn't going to let them go. They pressed on, their hearts pounding, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, as the voices of the dead whispered and followed close behind. Darkness enveloped them like a suffocating shroud. The mine was more than a physical prison now. It had seeped into their minds, invaded their thoughts, and twisted their perception of reality. Every breath they took was heavy with despair, and every step forward felt like an invitation into the abyss. Jake led the way, his face grim, his flashlight beam barely cutting through the dense air. He had stopped speaking as much, his once confident bravado now worn away by the relentless grip of the mine. Sarah trudged behind him, silent and wary, her skepticism crumbling into something darker. Mike followed, his usual jokes abandoned as he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to the walls as if expecting them to close in at any moment. Laura, bringing up the rear, felt the pressure most acutely. The air around her felt heavier, almost tangible, as though it had become a living thing. Her every movement was accompanied by whispers, faint, persistent voices that crawled beneath her skin, whispering things she didn't want to hear. The shadows at the edge of the flashlight beams were too thick, too solid, as if they were more than just darkness. She could feel them watching. "What if we're dead?" Mike said suddenly, his voice cracking through the suffocating silence. "What if we've been dead this whole time, and this is hell?" "Shut up," Jake snapped, not turning to face him. "I'm serious," Mike continued, his voice rising in pitch. "Think about it. What if the collapse killed us, and now we're just wandering around down here? What if we're ghosts, and this is what happens when you die in a place like this?" "That doesn't make sense," Sarah muttered, her voice shaky but firm. "We're alive, Mike. We're just lost." But even as she said it, Laura could hear the doubt in her voice. "It feels like we're dead," Mike persisted, his breathing becoming more erratic. "I swear to God, my hands, they're colder, like I'm decomposing." Sarah stopped suddenly and turned to face him, her flashlight shaking slightly in her hand. "You're not decomposing, Mike. You're just scared, okay? We all are. We're not dead." But as Laura watched them, something flickered in her mind. The faces, those horrible faces carved into the walls. They hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she had felt them, felt their despair, their anger, their hopelessness. And now it felt as though that same despair was spreading through them, unraveling their minds bit by bit. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice flat. "There's no point standing around arguing." They resumed their slow march forward, though none of them had the same sense of urgency they once did. Each step was heavier than the last, as if the mine was draining the energy from their bodies. Laura felt it most acutely, the pull of the mine. It was like a living entity, feeding on their fear, their guilt. She had tried to ignore it, but it was becoming impossible. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, and now she could almost make out words. "Laura, come closer. We need you." She shook her head, trying to banish the voices. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. But as they walked, the walls of the mine seemed to warp and shift. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. The others were seeing it too. The once straight corridors now twisted unnaturally, leading them in circles. Every passage felt the same, yet subtly different, as if the mine itself were alive and toying with them. "Where the hell are we?" Sarah muttered. "This can't be the same tunnel. It doesn't look right." "It's playing tricks on us," Laura said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "The mine. It's trying to keep us here." Jake stopped, his flashlight beam flickering as he turned to face her. "What the hell are you talking about?" Laura swallowed, her throat dry. "I can feel it. There's something ancient down here. It's been feeding off of us, warping everything. The more afraid we get, the more it controls us. It's not just a mine, it's alive. That's insane, Jake spat, though the flicker of fear in his eyes betrayed him. Is it? Laura asked, her voice rising. Think about it. The shifting walls, the voices, the things we've been seeing. It's real. This place isn't normal. We have to face it or we're never getting out. Mike laughed then, but it was a hysterical, broken sound. Get out? We're never getting out, Laura. Haven't you figured that out yet? Suddenly there was a low rumble, and the walls around them trembled. The sound was deep and ominous, like the mine itself was groaning in pleasure. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to close in even tighter. Laura felt something cold brush against her arm, and she spun around, her heart racing. There was nothing there, just shadows, but the touch had been real. She could still feel the icy imprint on her skin. We need to move, Jake said, his voice more urgent now. I don't care what you think is happening, but standing here isn't helping. But as they turned to continue, the tunnel ahead of them changed. The path that had been there moments before was now blocked by a solid wall of stone, and the tunnel behind them, the one they had just come from, was gone. Panic gripped Sarah, her breath coming in short gasps. No, 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 this can't be happening. It's real, Laura said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. The mine. It's alive. Jake slammed his fist against the wall in frustration. We're not going to die down here. But as he said it, the voices returned, louder this time, clearer. Jake, one of the voices called, deep and echoing from the walls. It was a voice they hadn't heard before. It was low, smooth, and deeply familiar. Jake froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. No, he whispered, shaking his head. That's not possible. Jake, the voice repeated, more insistent. It was coming from the darkness, growing louder with each second. Laura watched in horror as Jake's expression changed from defiance to something else, something far worse. His face paled and his flashlight trembled in his hand. He took a step back, shaking his head. That's not real, he whispered to himself. You're dead. The others exchanged worried glances, but before anyone could say anything, the voice spoke again, this time much closer. Jake, it's your fault. You let me die. No, Jake screamed, his voice cracking. He dropped the flashlight, plunging them into semi-darkness as he stumbled back against the wall. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't. Sarah reached out to steady him, but he swatted her hand away, his breathing erratic. It wasn't my fault, he repeated, almost to himself. It wasn't my fault. Laura stepped closer, her heart pounding. Jake, what's happening? He didn't answer, his eyes wide with fear as the voice echoed through the tunnel, repeating the same accusation over and over. You let me die. You let me die. You let me die. It was then that Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Who is it, Jake? Who's talking to you? Jake swallowed hard, his hands trembling. My brother, he said, his voice hollow. It's my brother. For a moment there was only silence. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the mine was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then slowly, deliberately, the shadows around them shifted. From the darkness emerged a figure, a young man, his face pale and streaked with dirt and blood. His clothes were torn, his eyes wide and empty, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. Jake, the figure whispered, stepping closer. Why did you let me die? Jake let out a strangled sob, backing away, his face contorted in agony. "No, no, no, you're not real. You're not real." The figure came closer, its eyes locking onto Jake's, and the other stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. "Jake," it whispered again, its voice low and deadly. "You left me." As the figure closed in on Jake, Laura felt a rush of cold air sweep through the tunnel, and for a moment she saw something flicker in the corners of her vision. A blur of movement, a whisper of sound. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. And then the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Jake collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged and broken. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The mine was winning. It had found their weaknesses, their deepest fears, and it was using them to break them down, one by one. Laura stepped forward, kneeling beside Jake. "It's not real," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure. "It's the mine. It's trying to destroy us." Jake didn't respond, his body trembling with the weight of his guilt. The others stood in silence, the shadows watching, waiting. They were trapped, not just in the mine, but in their own minds, and there was no way out. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the narrowing tunnel, the light from his dying flashlight flickering like a heartbeat on the verge of failure. Laura was beside him, her face drawn and pale, her eyes hollow from days. No, maybe weeks of torment. Time had long since lost its meaning down here. The mine had twisted and coiled around them, warping not just their sense of direction, but their very souls. The others were gone. Sarah, Mike, swallowed by the darkness, or worse, claimed by the malevolent presence that lurked within the mine. Jake's memories of their final moments were a blur, an agonizing haze of screams, shifting shadows, and those voices. God, the voices. They hadn't stopped calling to him since that first night, since the mine had chosen him. But Laura remained, quiet, stoic, and somehow always a step ahead of the mine's cruelty. She seemed untouched by the despair that had devoured the others. It didn't make sense, but Jake couldn't bring himself to question it. She was the only thing tethering him to any shred of sanity, and he clung to that fragile connection with everything he had left. The tunnel ahead widened, revealing a cavern unlike anything they had seen before. Massive, ancient, and drenched in shadows, the walls were lined with jagged rock, the air thick with the unmistakable stench of decay. In the center of the cavern stood an altar of stone, blackened by time and ritual, its surface slick with a dark substance that Jake refused to examine too closely. As they stepped into the cavern, the whispers that had haunted them since the collapse fell silent. The oppressive weight of the mine lifted, replaced by something far more terrifying, the sensation of being watched, not by the ghosts that had stalked them, but by the mine itself. The air grew thick with malice, and Jake felt it deep in his bones. This was the heart of the mine, the source of everything. "This is it," Laura said softly, her voice carrying an odd serenity. "We're here." Jake glanced at her, frowning. "How do you know?" She turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they'd entered the mine. They were different now, colder, sharper, filled with a knowledge that sent a shiver down his spine. "I've always known," she said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "I just didn't remember until now." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as her words settled in. "What are you talking about? What do you mean you've always known?" Laura stepped closer to the altar, her hand hovering just above its surface. "The mine called to me, Jake, just like it called to you. But I wasn't meant to leave. None of us were." She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "We were chosen." Jake shook his head, backing away from her. No, that's not true. We can still get out. We can find a way out." "There is no way out," she said softly, the finality in her voice crushing. "There never was." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, trying to process what she was saying. "But we were supposed to explore the mine to prove it was just another ghost story. This was supposed to be an adventure." His voice broke, the desperate denial clawing at him. "That's what the mine wanted you to think," Laura said, stepping closer, her eyes dark with understanding. "It lured you here, just like it lured everyone before us. We weren't the first, Jake. We won't be the last." Jake's stomach churned as the reality of it all began to sink in. The mine had been toying with them, feeding on their fear, their guilt, their secrets. And now, standing in this cavern, Jake felt it more intensely than ever. The presence of something ancient, something far beyond his understanding. The mine was alive, but more than that, it was hungry. "No," Jake whispered, shaking his head violently. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." Laura smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had accepted a truth that was far too terrible to speak aloud. "You know there isn't. The mine never lets anyone go. It feeds on us, Jake, on our fears, our regrets. We've been part of its curse since the moment we stepped inside." Jake's legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees. The weight of his guilt, his fear, and the crushing realization that he had led his friends to their deaths was unbearable. He could hear his brother's voice again, clearer now, more insistent. "You let me die." Jake buried his face in his hands, choking back sobs. He couldn't do this. He couldn't face it. The mine was right. It was his fault. He had led them here. He had pushed them forward, even when the warnings were clear. And now, they were all gone. "You're wrong," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't deserve this." Laura crouched beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was something else. "The mind doesn't care what we deserve, Jake. It only cares about what it needs. And now it needs a new soul." Jake looked up at her, his blood running cold. "What do you mean?" "I was chosen to stay," she said, her voice hollow. "But the mine needs you, Jake. You've been carrying your guilt, your fear for so long. That's what it feeds on. You can't escape it. The mine won't let you." As her words sank in, Jake's heart raced, his mind screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything to avoid what was coming. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The mine had him. It had always had him. "Stay here," Laura said, her voice barely a whisper now. "Give yourself to the mine, and maybe, just maybe, the others will rest." Jake's breath caught in his throat as he looked at her. Laura's eyes shimmered with something he couldn't name. Pity, perhaps, or maybe just acceptance. She had been the mine's from the start. A part of him knew that now. She had never been just another victim. She had been the bait. He turned to the altar, his hands shaking as he reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed the cold, slick stone, a wave of energy coursed through him, freezing him in place. The cavern seemed to expand, the darkness swirling around him, tightening its grip on his mind. The mine whispered to him, louder now, its voice filling every corner of his consciousness. It was all true. There was no way out. Not for him. Not for anyone. Jake's legs buckled again, and he collapsed at the foot of the altar, the weight of the mind pressing down on him, suffocating him. He was trapped. Forever. As his vision began to blur, he saw Laura standing over him, her face serene. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. "You'll see them again," she said softly, "but not in the way you think." With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake alone in the cavern. Alone with the mine. The darkness swallowed him whole, and somewhere deep within the mine, far beyond the reach of human understanding, something stirred, something ancient, something hungry. The mine had claimed its prize, and it would wait. It would always wait for the next soul to enter.